Hi guys. So we are going to continue the discussion about the Palestine and the Arab-Israeli conflict. So we stopped at the creation of Israel and how they created a parliamentary and unicameral parliamentary system. Now we're going to see what kind of relationship the Israel and Palestine had after 1948. So the after establishing their own their own state with this polity structure of parliamentary and unicameralism, parliamentary government and unicameral parliamentary system, and we mentioned something about their military program about the reserve system and how women and men remain kind of active to be recruited in the Israeli army until mid 40s and mid 30s. And there is a common consensus that this is like an obligation and the source of a national pride in order to perpetuate the Israeli existence and presence in the region. So Palestinians remained without any sort of leadership or organizational framework or any focal point to negotiate their rights and their status with the Israeli government. But we're going to see how the PLO, the Palestinian Liberation Organization, emerged and claimed the representation of the Palestinians, especially after the June defeat of 1967. So what happened in 1967? Israel tried to committed aggressive actions against its neighbors. Mainly, they decided to the diversion of the river of Jordan and some military operation on the Syrian borders. So Syria, like the Ba'athist and nationalist political figures, tried to pull Nasser into this radical framework in order to launch a war, also declare a war against Israel, especially after the diversion of the river of Jordan, in order to absorb the increasing numbers of the Jewish immigration. Nasser as well, during that period, Nasser himself and the Saudi ruling family fell out over Yemen, as I mentioned before, and the conservative regimes. So that's Nasser, got engaged in this ideological Cold War with the Saudi Arabia and the conservative monarchies, and in return they seized the opportunity in order to criticize Nasser and to join the critics against Nasser regime, that he had to live up to people's expectation about pan-Arabism, and he had to stop the Israeli advancement or the Israeli attack on the Arab territories. So Nasser actually got dragged into this what was called Damascus Cairo radical axis, and he ordered the withdrawal of the United Nations emergency forces stationed in Sinai after the Suez crisis in 1956. And by ordering this withdrawal and sending troops with kind of commands to launch any kind of offensive in a case of attack, so this action triggered a counter mobilization from the Israeli from the Israeli government, and both sides descended into this unplanned war for Nasser and Ba'athist in Syria, and they dragged as well the Hussein of Jordan as well. He didn't want to join in the beginning, but after this popular pressure in order to defend the pan-Arabism cause and the Palestine cause as well, he ended up joining this radical move led by Nasser and Ba'athist in Syria. So Nasser ordered this withdrawal of the United Nations forces, and then he closed the Aqaba Gulf and put an end to the existence of the Israeli forces in the Red Sea. that was kind of concession offered to Israel after the Suez crisis, and he prevented, any kind of shipping or navigation in the Red Sea. So it was a kind of a like declaration of war that ended with like loss of territories. So the Syria lost the Golan Heights, and Jordan actually lost the West Bank, and Egypt lost kind of lost and got like the Israeli troops invaded and occupied Sinai. So they had like to defend themselves now, not only to defend the Palestinian cause, but they have like to stick to this pan-Arabism in order to liberate their own territories. So the pan-Arabism started to lose its traction, and they started like to kind of round of indirect negotiations with the Israeli forces or with the Israeli government under the leadership or with the United States to decided to mediate, this kind of indirect talks or indirect negotiation. So this pan-Arabism ideology gave way to the pursuit of this limited territorial interest. Now they had to recover their own like occupied lands or territory, and Palestine at this point, the main issues, or the main defenders of the Palestine cause was the main defenders were guerrilla movements or paramilitary organizations. They actually operated from outside the territory, the Palestine territories. So after the June defeat, Nasser had to accept the United Nations Security Council Resolution 242. It was mainly land for peace resolution. So Israel had to relinquish lands in return for the peace, the commitment, to establishing peace in the Middle East. Nasser had to accept, the resolution at the end of the day, and Egypt started to focus more, especially after the death of Nasser, to focus more on its own interest and to advance different kind of priorities, leaving the leadership of the Palestine cause to the PLO. So two crucial points, as I'm going to explain in some detail, happened in 1974 and then in 1988. In 1974, Egypt led like some efforts in order to have a resolution from the Arab League in order to give the PLO the right to be the only representative of Palestinian people, in order to get itself out of this cause, and then the PLO, after like decades of rejecting to recognize the right of Israel to exist in peace, it led to this declaration. Yasser Arafat made this declaration in 1988 to accept the United Nations resolution and recognized actually the existence of Israel. So the Fidayeen, or the advocates of armed resistance against Israel, they led the Palestinian cause, or they defended the Palestinians, and they tried to lead some disorganized acts or violent acts in order to defend Palestinians. So the PLO emerged as a kind of an umbrella organization in 1969, and it was not only it gathered or it drew together different organizations, including Al-Fatah. It was under the leadership of Yasser Arafat. So it was like Yasser Arafat and Fatah advocated, this armed resistance and struggle in order to recover the entire territory, the entire territories or the entire land of Palestine. And as I mentioned, he rejected the United Nations Security Council Resolution 242 on two grounds. Firstly, it included kind of recognition of Israel or its right to exist, and secondly, it actually mentioned Palestinians as kind of refugees. So the resolution like refers to Palestinians as like the cause of Palestine reduced to this refugee camps, and without mentioning anything about the right of the Palestinian people to establish their national or independent state or national home. So the Yasser Arafat advocated this, hardline stance, and he believed in this armed struggle or armed resistance against Israel, and he adopted this national secular nationalist ideology. He focused mainly on Palestine without linking the Palestine cause to pan-Arabism or Nasserism or any kind of any other ideological thrust or content. But it was not only the only organization that tried to defend Palestinians' rights. Two other famous associations or organizations, the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine and the Democratic Front for the Liberation of Palestine. So the Popular Front actually grew out of the pro-Nasserist group in Lebanon. So it tied itself, it connected itself somehow with the Nasserism or with the Nasserist cause, and the members, they made this link or ties between Palestine and the defense of the Palestine cause with the social revolution in the Arab world. So absorbing kind of the Palestinian cause into pan-Arabism or Nasserism. And then the Democratic Front, it was like kind of on the left, the political left of the Fatah. It actually focused mainly on workers and peasants. It had kind of Marxist and leftist ideological content. But Fatah was focused mainly on this nationalist cause, and it was with secular orientation. So that's why the PLO emerged as an umbrella of all all of these organizations. And Yasser Arafat was elected as kind of the executive director of the PLO. He presided over the organization, and he took the lead on different issues regarding the Palestinian cause. So the PLO lacked, this kind of like a stable base of military operations. So that's why the Palestinian guerrilla groups or paramilitary organizations, after the establishment of the reorganization into a PLO, so they had to secure some to gain some military bases in order to have their own operations or to undertake their own operations. So they opted for Jordan in order to launch their military operations against Israel. So what happened? They tried to violate the sovereignty of the King Hussein over his own lands, and so many guerrilla commandos, tried to undertake some violent actions, and the hijacked, the crucial event happened when they hijacked 4 civilian airlines, and they threatened to blow up the planes and to kill the hostages. So Hussein had two options, either to concede or to tolerate any kind of erosion of his authority over his own lands, because the guerrilla movements, they acted as a state within a state somehow, or to crack down or to smash the guerrilla movements or the guerrilla organizations in Jordan. So what happened in September 1970? He actually brutally bombarded the refugee camps, of Palestinians, and he pursued the commandos across the country, and he brutally killed Palestinians. Roughly, the total number of casualties reached 3,000 Palestinians. And then the PLO had to find a different territorial base, and they transferred to Lebanon. And it had as well these kind of armed resistance and violent actions led to so many kind of disturbances inside Lebanon. Um, and that's why they had like to leave Lebanon, as we are going to see when we study the civil wars. They had to rebase, themselves into in Tunisia. So as I mentioned last lecture, the Workers' Party dominated the like had kind of dominance over Israeli politics since 1949 until 1977. So what happened in 1977? It was the election of a new political bloc led by a revisionist Zionist and Likud party. So people like especially Oriental Jews or Sephardic tried to penalize Workers' Party for their segregation and their isolation from the political process, and actually they had their they needed to vocalize their opposition to nepotistic and this corrupt politics led by many workers, the Labour Party's figures. So the emergence of the Likud bloc, they didn't invent, any kind of religious resurgence. It was there, but the atmosphere made it like much more conducive in order to advance this ideas of revisionist Zionism and uncompromised Zionism. So they just went ahead with the establishment of many settlements in order to further isolate the Arab areas, and it had as well like economic component as well by confiscating lands. Begin actually like led the bloc, and he was the prime minister, and he promulgated like a legal framework in order to enable him to confiscate land, the Arab lands, and he had this legal pretext like this uncultivated lands were considered as a state, kind of a state lands. So that's why he had like control over the Arab lands, and he confiscated roughly 40% of the land area in the West Bank. So this had like some economic repercussions for Palestinians' lives or the economy and the living conditions of Palestinians, because it made them dependent on the Israeli government and the Israeli economy, and it led more or added more to their anger and to their suffering inside Israel. So they had only one option, like they don't have like until like throughout the 70s, the Palestinians didn't have like any credible or honest leadership in order to claim their representation. So that's why they accepted Yasser Arafat and the PLO, Yasser Arafat to be like the spokesman of the Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza, and they accepted the PLO as a kind to function as a government, and it helped with entrenching this image and this function by offering so many like services like health and education services to the refugee camps in the Arab region. And then like this role actually kind of established officially in Rabat Summit in 1974. That was after the war in 1973. This kind of coordinated Arab attack between Egypt and Syria against Israel in order to liberate the Golan Heights and Sinai, and they did well in the beginning. And Egypt had like separate peace trajectory with Israel, and it had like to leave out this Palestinian cause or the defend the or the representation of Palestinians to the PLO. So that's why the Sadat actually led some efforts in order to have a resolution that like stipulated or enacted, this kind of formal or official position of the PLO as a representative of Palestinians. So that was like the settlements, the construction of settlements between 67 and until mid 77. So that like, they have like, you know, the actually cut across, you know, different areas, different Arab areas, you know, in the West Bank, and it was very difficult to have like a coherent and unified state in the West Bank. So it added like, you know, to their like everyday or daily suffering. So they had like, you know, to go through like different checkpoints. They had like to make their ways, you know, through these kind of walls and barriers, and it actually prevented any kind of development of coherent organizations that would represent, you know, the Arab populations there. And again, like, you know, the economic suffering as well. Invasion of Lebanon in 1982 was like it was like another turning point inside Israel, and subsequently the relationship between Israel and Palestinians. So after the invasion, like what happened was like kind of division between Labor Party and Likud Party inside Israel, and this gave rise to small religious or extremist parties on the, like, you know, the both extremes of the political spectrum. And they didn't agree, they disputed over, you know, this kind of territorial domain. And Labor Party like favored this kind of territorial compromise, while the Code Party, they were like the like the members or supporters, actually they still believe in this great Israel and non-compromisable or revisionist Zionism. So they had like, you know, they adopted this hardline policy, and Labor Party, like the members leaned more towards, you know, offering some kind of compromise. So the changing the demographic composition, with the like having a segment of young population and educated population. So Palestinians tried to develop kind of awareness or consciousness about their status of, you know, being occupied, and like the being like, you know, the denied or deprived of the basic natural rights. So they started, you know, to revolt or to organize, you know, their own popular uprising. It was like the first intifada happened in December 1987. In the beginning it was like, you know, non-organized or non-planned popular uprising or popular resistance. So it was like the demonstrators or protesters actually they invested in one event after killing the military for the Israeli military forces killed 4 Palestinians, and then this led to the outbreak of mass demonstrations against the Israeli troops, and it actually led to the, like soon after the West Bank, it was in Gaza, and then the West Bank joined the demonstrators or the protesters. So and then the unified national leadership from different local factions that affiliated with the PLO, they started to reorganize, you know, different when the uprising or the intifada, you know, gained kind of momentum. So they needed to keep this momentum by offering some kind of organizational signpost or guidance in order to offer like directions and like common or declared program in order to keep the momentum. So some, like, you know, well known like or like well positioned Palestinians, they organized this 14-point program and then endorsed by the UNL. So according to the 14-point the most important points according the program, it was like, you know, freezing or ending, you know, this construction of settlement. This like remained one of the main troublesome issue that hindered, you know, any kind of negotiation between Israel and Palestinians, and canceling any kind of special taxes imposed on Palestinians, and recognition of the existence of the independent Palestinian state under the leadership of the PLO. So they asked for their own independent state and some improvement in their economic and social conditions, and putting an end, to the construction of the settlements. And they initially thought about prolonging, this kind of violent or struggle, the armed struggle. It was not like armed in the beginning, so they used this kind of stone throwing and mobilization against, the collecting or organizing protesters in order to vocalize their opposition or their challenge against the Israeli forces to end the occupation. And then they had this tactic, with prolonging, this kind of tactic, these kind of contentious tactics. This would increase the cost, would impose kind of economic burden on the Israeli government. So that's why that's how, Israeli government would kind of offer some concessions or would meet, their demands. But actually things went out of control, and then they started, some of the protesters and demonstrators resorted to some violent and armed struggle against Israeli even civilians, and this triggered, more violence from the settlers. And in this atmosphere, on this environment, it was the formation of Hamas, the Islamic resistance movement, with from the name, it has this kind of Islamic ideological content or Islamic outlook, in order to introduce itself as a viable alternative to the secular nationalist ideology of the PLO. And during that period, the PLO tried to achieve any kind of diplomatic achievement or victory. And Yasser Arafat made, this historic announcement of 1988. It was considered as a kind of a two-state compromise. So according to his announcement, as I referred earlier, he recognized, the Israel's right to exist in peace, and he actually denounced the use of violence and the acceptance of the UN 242 resolution as a basis for international cooperation or international negotiation. And then he proclaimed, the Palestinian independent state in the West Bank and Gaza under his own leadership. But during that period, it was another revisionist Shamir was in power, and he actually, by Arafat announcement, tried actually to bring in the United States to play important role in the mediating, the relationship or the negotiation between the PLO and Israel. But a revisionist Zionist actually put an end to this. To these efforts, to have, these negotiations, and George Bush, had to to announce, the end or the break off, of the negotiations. So Arafat, by failing, to attract the United States in order to pressure Israel, also to have, something in return, because he offered already the concession by recognizing the existence of Israel and recognizing the UN resolution, what he had previously rejected. So he offered, some concessions without getting, something in return. So Arafat made, this fateful decision by aligning himself or the PLO with the Saddam Hussein. So it was the period of the first, the second Gulf War. So, and it was kind of the rhetoric or the discourse of Saddam, imperialist and anti-United States, anti-American discourse, and he had this fierce ideological attack against Israel. So he aligned himself with with Saddam, with Iraq, after failing to get the United States to mediate the relationship between the PLO and Israel. But things like got more kind of the environment got more permissible kind of by 1991. And both sides, they gathered, at Madrid conference. So what happened during that period? The Labour Party elected or like assumed power in Israel, and Rabin has the during that period he had this kind of it's not moderate, but he had like this orientation, to mitigate the impact or the effect of Hamas by approaching the PLO in order to neutralize Hamas, and the repercussions of the Intifada as well. So it raised, the Palestinian awareness, about their economic and social plight and their everyday suffering. And Israel, the fears of Hamas, increased. So that's, and PLO as well. It was like kind of fear of being overtaken by Hamas. So that's why they decided, to reach, to converge on something or to reach a compromise. That was the initial thought. And the Gulf War as well, led to heavy existence and presence of the United States in the region, and that's why the United States needed to restore some sort of peace or stable relationship between the Israel and the PLO or Palestinians during that period. So it was kind of permissible environment or conditions in order to have this kind of talk between Israel and the PLO. So they met at they had this direct communications between both sides. They had this kind of communication in Madrid in 1991, and they brought not only the PLO but also some insiders, some Palestinians, in order to explain their or to defend their cause and explain their everyday suffering. And then after conducting some research, one research institute in Norway conducted this research, conducted a survey or a research, and it came up with the finding or a result kind of political leaderships, political leaders from both parties or from both sides. They had they were willing to have this kind of negotiation. So Oslo emerged actually from outside this normal diplomatic channel. So the Norway the government offered to have this kind of secret talk or negotiation between Israel and the PLO in order to reach some sort of peace settlement or peace treaty. So again, they had they disagreed over one troubling issue about the settlement. Before Oslo, so what happened after Madrid? The Likud bloc refused to offer any kind of concessions, and George Bush tried to have this fierce attitude towards Israeli leaders. So he threatened them by suspending the financial aid to Israel, but if not accepting to put an end to or to freeze the construction of the settlement. And he actually effectively used this weapon. But again the Likud government refused to back down, and that's why it led to kind of deterioration between the Likud government and the American administration, because they needed the financial aid. They couldn't have afforded the construction of these settlements without the financial aid from the United States. But again the Likud party didn't want to concede too much, or to offer some concessions regarding the establishment or the construction of the settlement. But by the Labour Party, they had like this different attitude, and Rabin actually offered some partial freezement of the construction. It was like not totally like accepting George Bush offer, but it was like it was kind of it was like enough good enough move in order to convince the American administration to transfer the financial aid and to resume the the peace talk between Israel and Palestinians. And the breakthrough happened in 1993 with Oslo. So before that, it was like several attempts, without ratifying any kind of formal document or a treaty between both sides. So the first document of Oslo, it was kind of a mutual recognition, like the Israel, admitted or recognized, the right of the Palestinians to have the independent kind of independent authority in the West Bank and Gaza. And in return, and already Yasser Arafat made this in the 1988, the recognition, they recognized, the Israel's rights to exist in peace in the region. So they had like different round of peace talks after Madrid, and then all of a sudden they reached or ratified this unexpected agreement, and then Oslo One, referred to like Oslo and the Declaration of Principles on Palestinian Civil Rule in 1993. So according, this actually propelled both sides, to ratify, the kind of treaty in order to agree on some principles. So according to or actually before like the terms of the Oslo One. So the conditions as well in 1993 was the conditions actually were very like conducive in order to ratify this treaty. So again, like Arafat still like had some fears of Hamas, and Bill Clinton as well like reached power in the United States, and he was known for his pro-Israeli stance, and he was unwilling to exert some pressures like George Bush, by playing with the financial aid card in order to compel Israel to do something. So this actually encouraged, it did encourage Israeli government to continue with the negotiation. And they needed like as well like the Labor Party, they needed to neutralize the maximalist, the revisionist Zionist. So they needed like to establish the national unity government, and they needed to overcome the deep divisions inside the Israeli society. So that's why perhaps like they achieved this unexpected move by ratifying this treaty. And so according to Oslo One, the declaration on of the principles, it gave like a 5-year preparation for a transitional Palestinian as a transitional period to establish Palestinian autonomy over the West Bank and Gaza. But again, Israel retained, the sovereignty over the lands throughout, the terms of the government. But it offered some administrative responsibilities, or like agreed on some administrative control over the land for Palestinians. So the PLO like assumed some like service providing, or undertook like service providing policies like healthcare, education, imposing taxes or whatever. So they did, they had some governmental or administrative responsibilities, but Israel still had the sovereignty over the lands. And it promised, with kind of deployment of forces in the West Bank area. It's like the non-populated outer area of the West Bank. But this agreement didn't have any clear or explicit mention to Israel, to the state, like the establishment of a Palestinian state. It didn't have any clear mention, of establishing state. It was kind of administrative responsibilities. And then like the final agreement also referred to or known as like Oslo II in 1997. It asserted, this redeployment of forces, and it offered like, civil authority for the Palestinian Authority to establish itself in the West Bank and Gaza, and then the division of the West Bank in 3 areas. Here you have like, these areas, but again, like, truncated with many barriers and major checkpoints. So like from this map and the terms of the agreements, it was very clear like that the PLO actually negotiated from a position of weakness. It didn't gain like, so much, like it's very difficult to establish like from this map, like looking at these major checkpoints and barriers. It was very difficult for any like authority to establish like, its own sovereignty over a coherent portion of land. But like one of the major victory or the main achievement of these agreements, the establishment of the Palestinian Authority and the return of Arafat in July in 1994. He established, his own authority in the beginning in Gaza, and it was like, a very bold move, because for like Israeli elite circles, Arafat like led some of the armed struggle against Israel, and then they agreed, on his return to Palestine. So it was like, kind of portrayed as like, one of the major achievement of the Oslo process or settlement. And then like Jordan this actually triggered, more peace agreement with the Arab countries, and Jordan actually had its own agreement with Israel in fall 1994. But like it satisfied neither party. Like the Oslo settlements, the divided oppositions inside Israel and inside Palestine as well. So for Israelis, it triggered more opposition from extremist party or ultra-Orthodox, political parties, and the revisionist Zionists that refused, to concede any piece of land, and actually they have considered the West Bank and Gaza as parts of Great Israel. For Palestinians, it actually decreased the popularity of the PLO, because for them they led the opposition. They hijacked, the Intifada. They depicted them as outsiders, and they actually looked down upon them by calling them the Tunisians, because like they were based in Tunisia, and so they perceived them like, insider Palestinians. They perceived the PLO and its leadership as kind of an outsider to the Palestinian society, or even like, their historical suffering. And Hamas as well, Hamas like had different oppositional standpoint and different tactic regarding different relationship with the territory first, and different tactic to recover this the entire territories. So for Hamas, actually, deployment of the armed resistance and deployment of violent action are like, important pillars in their ideology or in their like movement against Israelis. So Hamas actually committed and started to commit like suicide bombing and many other like, violent actions against Israelis and against settlers as well, and this triggered, more retaliation from the Israeli government, and actually they asked Arafat to rein in Hamas militia, and he was like, in a bad situation, because this undermined his credibility, as an honest and credible and competent leader for Palestinians, and he had to prove his ability to govern to the Israeli government as well, and he had to conform to the Oslo settlement or the Oslo agreements. So this actually decreased, his popularity and created, kind of disenchantment between different white bases or white segments of Palestinians and the PLO. What added to this, his domineering attitude or his authoritarian attitude in taking decisions and running the Palestinian Authority. And he held his own circles that they were embedded into patronage network, and they accumulated profits at the expense of the Palestinian people. So the economic conditions and the social conditions, didn't improve much under the Palestinian Authority, and people started to place blame on Arafat because of his authoritarian attitude first, and then the outsider position second, and third, his social and economic policies as well that benefited, his close or narrow circles. And in Israel as well, extremists, never got satisfied with the Oslo process or agreement, and they didn't agree, to give up, any portion of land to Palestinians. So the process or this kind of violent circle eventually led to the assassination of Rabin, and again, the emergence of the new hardliner, politician, with the formation of the first Netanyahu government in Israel, with the advent of Likud to power. So these kind of the violent actions and these rounds of armed struggle between Hamas and Palestinians on the one hand, and IDF on the other, it led to mutual suspicion, they didn't actually, Arafat didn't actually, he lost credibility. He didn't have any kind of authority in order to impose peace, or in order to reject or to make clear renunciation of terrorism, or the terrorist attacks, as they called committed by Hamas. And this led to the suspicion of the negotiation or peace talks as well between the two parties. And then the Netanyahu and Likud party, back in power, and it led to more complexity or difficulty to resume any kind of peace talk. So it was clear kind of imbalance between power structures, or this kind of asymmetrical power structure between both sides. And the United States tried hard to salvage or to rescue the peace process. So in 1999, the White House tried to get both parties together in order to have another agreement in Y Accords in Maryland, Land for Peace and Security, in order to rescue this part of the UN resolution. But again, by accepting, it's a common story that will repeat itself over and over again. So even any Israeli government tried to offer some concessions, this would trigger some factions and some extremist groups to form their own parties in order to pressure the government not to concede or not to back down. So this led to some factions inside the Likud party, and eventually led to the resignation of Netanyahu. He had to call for a new elections, and then Barak came to power. And both sides started another round of peace talks in order to have to reach any kind of concrete agreement, especially on the some troubling issues never touched until that point, the right of return, like the refugee issues and the Jerusalem, the status of Jerusalem, and the settlements. Okay, so offering some concessions regarding even like the West Bank and Gaza, it triggered so many divisions and factions inside the Israeli parties. So with the elections of Barak, um, it put like both sides on a different, trajectory of a peace talk or a trajectory of negotiation, and this led to Camp David too. Barak actually led the efforts in order to withdraw from Lebanon. It was really kind of costly and perhaps irrational decision. So he tried to revitalize or to revive, this peace talks and promised, this withdrawal from Lebanon, and again it led to the stalemate or another gridlock in July 2000, and then it triggered more cabinet resignation that ended up with the resignation of Barak himself, and in order to call for a new elections and to form a new government. So Clinton tried to intervene in order to rescue, the peace talk, and he tried to offer, a new agreement, because like the Likud party, actually Netanyahu, he started, this policy of creating facts on the ground, in order to make it, much more difficult, for any Israeli government to concede by creating, these constructing and establishing settlements. So he created actually facts on the ground, and it became very difficult to reverse, or to dismantle these facts. And actually, he made these policies, made many concessions to extremist and religious parties, small parties, and offering any concessions, even like a small concession, would trigger, opposition from these religious and extremist parties. So that's why when any Israeli government tried to engage in the peace talk or the peace negotiations and tried to offer something, so this triggered, more factions within their own party. And they tried to please, as I mentioned, it's very difficult for any party to form a government, so they had, it's kind of a coalitional government, so they had to reach out to small parties in order to form a government. So they had to offer some concessions to these parties in order to join the coalition government. So the deadlock again in July 2000, and Clinton had to come up with a different framework in order to rescue the peace talk, or to have, like, this peace agreement, to push it further, or to revive it. So he offered the framework, for negotiation, by focusing mainly on the long neglected issues, as I mentioned, the status of Jerusalem, the right of return, the status of like East Jerusalem, because like the Palestinians needed to establish their own independent state with the East Jerusalem as its capital. So both sides and the United States have deferred, these issues for 7 years, and then Clinton at this point offered, this framework of negotiation in order to have, like, settlement regarding these issues. Again, like, the decreasing popularity of the PLO, and increasing, opposition and violent and armed resistance, from Hamas, it made it very difficult now for the Palestinian Authority, in order to make, credible or popular, to take any kind of popular or great national policy or ratification of a new treaty without getting, popular consensus, or the consensus of the Palestinians, which was like very difficult at this point. So if Camp David already was kind of too late, so Taba actually offered like too little, like, to talk about, these issues that have been, like, postponed for several years now, like, the Yasser Arafat was not in a position, to take any move regarding these issues. And what happened, it was like the eruption of the second Intifada. The triggering event happened with Sharon as a hardliner. He entered and visited Al-Haram al-Sharif, and Muslims or Palestinians, regarded this as offensive move, and they tried to and actually this actually triggered, a new round or a new circle of violence in Palestine. And the retaliation took a form of a military operation and occupation of the West Bank and Gaza. So it actually put an end, to any framework, any detailed framework regarding Jerusalem and refugees and the right of return. And it was it complicated, or uprooted again, this trajectory of the peace talk, and this triggered more efforts from some Arab countries and European countries to rescue the Oslo process or the Oslo settlement. So Saudi Arabia tried to have tried to push the Arab League to have any peace initiative, and then some European countries, including the EU and the United States, tried to have the roadmap in order to save, to break, this diplomatic gridlock or deadlock, and by offering a new framework for the normalization of the relationship between the Arab countries and Israel, and to have independent Palestinian state, and with the East Jerusalem as its capital. And it offered a new framework for the compensation for refugees, in order to have this roadmap, in order to revitalize, to break, this diplomatic gridlock, and to push for more negotiations. But actually, this roadmap, again, it lacked, any kind of enforcement mechanisms. So that's why, in order to put an end, to this conflict, the quartet, of powers, like the four powers, including, the EU and the United States, the supported by some Arab countries, they should have had this kind of enforcement mechanisms in order to end the conflict, but they actually lack this. And the Sharon actually proceeded with the construction of settlements and walls and barriers and checkpoints. And he pushed, plan through through Knesset, in order to proceed further, with his hardline policies. But actually, he toward the end, after this pressure from some European and countries and the United States, he agreed. He tried to convince Knesset by agreeing to a plan for evacuation from Gaza and the West Bank after occupying these territories. In 2002, what happened? The Israeli forces, confined Arafat in Ramallah, and this triggered divisions within the PLO between the old guards and the young members. A process ended with the death of Arafat in 2004, and then the Israeli government or the Israeli leaders tried to implement or to carry out what was called disengagement framework, with this triggered some opposition from members in Likud. But again, Sharon had different targets for him by implementing, by withdrawing or evacuating forces from the West Bank and Gaza. This would actually put an end to the roadmap and the pressures from the international community, and put an end to this call for establishing independent state with East Jerusalem as its capital. So he tried to get around, the roadmap and the peace initiative, the Arab peace initiative, But again, like, this triggered more factions and oppositions inside the Likud party, and he had to form his own party called Forward, with kind of different political program. After the death of Arafat, like, Abbas took responsibility for Palestinians, and he tried hard to build, credibility after, like, the erosion of the credibility of the PLO and decreasing the credibility and popularity of Yasser Arafat. Um, but again, Hamas, like, was very and still, like, but at this point in 2006, especially after, the death of Yasser Arafat, it tried to already built, its own base of support, especially in Gaza, from, like, people like the economically and socially suffered, and they introduced, like, Hamas leaders, they introduced themselves as insiders. They suffered, like other Palestinians, from the occupation and from the policies of the occupation. So they already had their own, like, power and social base at this point. And it was proved, with the 2006 elections, when Hamas actually, much to, like, everyone's surprise, gained the majority of seats in the legislative chamber. It gained, like, 76 seats to 43 to Fatah, or the, like, Abbas bloc. So what happened? The international community actually denied or refused to recognize the electoral results on the grounds that Hamas, like, is a terrorist organization, and it has been committed, or it actually committed kind of abhorrent, terrorist attacks. So that's why refused to recognize or to admit, its victory. And from the Palestinian side, or the pro-Hamas Palestinian supporters of Hamas, for them, they refuse to get punished, for their own free choice. So this triggered, some divisions or fights between Fatah and Hamas, and as I mentioned, Hamas, it had, like, its own social and political support in Gaza, so it actually managed to make use of this and seized Gaza and took control over the Gaza Strip. And this triggered, like, more kind of fights and factions between Hamas and Fatah, and Israel actually, like, put Gaza under siege, and the UN had different resolutions, like, describing both sides, Israeli side, the Israeli side and Hamas, as war committing, war crimes. Abbas tried to renew, this peace talk with Almer, but again, the trajectory collapsed again in 2008 because of the Almer actually got accused of corruption, and he had to leave the government. He had to resign. So they again, like, put another, like, end to the peace talk or the peace process, and then Netanyahu assumed power again in 2009. And he tried to offer kind of a compromise by offering, this conditional two-state solution. But it's conditional because he asked the Abbas, or the Palestinian Authority, to admit, the Jewishness, nature of Israel, and this actually Hamas and Fatah or Abbas actually refused, to concede to this demand, because it denied, the historical rights of Palestinians in their land. So it led to another stalemate, or another diplomatic and actual, gridlock between both sides. So what happened after, from 2010 until, like, the deal of the century? So we still have, like, a simulation model on on this issue, on this topic. So you guys will cover. I'll post some instructions, but we will probably have the simulation model on Zoom. So I'll send the link, to Zoom meeting. Um, so we are going to talk about, the developments, in the last 10 years until we reach. We need to I'll investigate in some detail, the deal of the century, and how the international context, or some changes, in the political orientation of the Arab leaders and the Arab countries and the regional context as well, led us, to this point. And there is kind of a debate between whether or not, the lack or the absence of this unified leadership in Palestine was like the main issue that prevented, the continuation of the peace talk or the peace process. So they should have they should have like a coherent leadership or a unified government first. So they have, meaning they have to sort out, this relationship between Hamas and Fatah, and then in order to pressure Israel to revive the peace process. And another, you have now an overview about what happened, different rounds of peace talks and different different peace treaties already signed, and how Israeli government they circumvented these kind of talks and violated the terms several times, because of each time it led to, or it triggered some divisions or factions within political parties, and actually some sort of issues have been untouchable or inherently insoluble between the both sides. So now you have the overview about the trajectories of the peace talks or the peace negotiations, and then this kind of debate about whether the balance of power between both sides, or the lack of the unified leadership, or the internal fraction within the Palestinian Authority that prevented the implementation of any peace agreement. And then we will have our simulation model on the boycott, divestment, and sanction, and how some civil society organizations try to draw together different forces that the advocates for Palestinian cause, in order to put more pressures on Israeli government, in order to actually to defend the Palestinian right, or to pressure the some countries to put pressures on Israel in order to offer some concessions, or to abide by the peace agreements. So we will have 1 hour and 15 minutes, and so I'll have half an hour to talk about the developments after from 2001 until or from 2010 until the deal of the century. And then you will have your simulation model on the BDS, and you will cover the historical, or the setting of its emergence, or the origins of the movement, and how you will be divided into two groups. Some will argue for, and others will argue against. And you guys have to cover the role of sanctions in the IR, whether or not it will lead to compliance, or would trigger more violent repudiation, or violent reaction. I'll post some instructions closer to the date on Moodle, on Blackboard, and you will have an updated outline with the new due dates. So you will have your take-home exam it's due on April 13, and you should start you should start thinking about the topic of your term paper, because you need to get my approval before you start working. So you need to email me your topic in order to get my approval on the term paper. Meanwhile, if you have like 3 lectures this week, so you can like send me an email if you have any question, and we can have like next week perhaps like online forum to have kind of discussion about next week and this week topic. Bye.